So while Martin's plugging in, I'll make a start. So thank you, everyone, for contributing to the discussion. Martin, thank you for your note-taking. It's been interesting seeing how different people have approached this summary task. We've gone for a slightly different model. So I'm going to make some general comments about what we talked about. And then there were particular nuggets and examples that came up in the conversation that Martin thought were quite interesting. We thought we'd just rehearse some of those with you. So we were talking about reconciling industrial innovation, science and technology policies. And effectively, there were three subtopics to that. So the first one was about managing interfaces between government departments. The second was about avoiding overlaps and omissions between policies. And the third was about ensuring coverage of the full innovation pipeline. So some general observations on this. It was fascinating because all three conversations, we ended up talking more about the first question and the challenges of managing interfaces between government departments than anything else. And that didn't matter whether we started with the first question or we started with the third question and said, please focus on the third question. And immediately people went up to the top question when it's really tough working with my colleagues across government. So that's a common theme that lots of people felt. We also said, though, that it's not just about the government departments and agencies, but actually there are all sorts of other interfaces that we need to get right in thinking about any of these policies. So interfaces with industry, interfaces with academia, interfaces with RTOs, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get into conversations about interfaces with place. And I'll come back to the theme of geography later because that came up a lot in the conversation. And then some interesting conversations about time horizon and saying, actually, you need to think about things across different time horizons because the way the policy plays out, it becomes quite different across time horizons. So a lovely example was given of work on quantum, where the Royal Academy of Engineering were doing work on quantum. They wanted to talk to some people doing work on semiconductors. The semiconductors crowd were much more interested in the short-term issue. What's the problem we're solving today? The quantum's a much longer-term conversation, and yet they're around some of the same underlying or linked technologies. And so how do we manage the time dimension to this? The other general observation I'd make is that we really struggled with evidence. So I kept pushing and saying, can we get something in the evidence column? And generally, every time I asked that question, people just went, can we talk about the problems with working with departments again? There were one or two examples. So AEC doing some work on a project on mapping missions and strategies and so on. But otherwise, it felt really quite sparse and quite difficult as a topic area. So on interfaces, why was that so topical? Well, I think the first thing was a general observation that said actually the structures that we've got, and it's not surprising that this is the case, but the structures that we've got often make discussions between government departments, particularly when it comes to spending reviews and budget allocation, effectively a zero-sum game. And people end up competing and arguing for their particular part of the budget. And so we set up structures that end up with that competition. We also, and Tim alluded to this, we also have situations where departments quite rightly feel really strongly about particular priority areas, but those priority areas can be in competition. So the AI one, people pushing for AI, that's got implications for energy consumption. So then you start to say, well, why don't we get data centers that are powered by renewable energy or nuclear energy, and then you get people on the nuclear agenda going, well, do we want to go down the nuclear route or not? So there's all those different departmental owned priorities, if you like, that inevitably come into competition with one another. We had some interesting conversations about how do you then deal with this. So one discussion that came up 2 or 3 times was about size of government departments. And we used the example of BEIS a couple of times. So BEIS was Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy. Greg was the Secretary of State there. That was seen as both a good thing, not Greg being Secretary of State, that was always seen as a good thing. But the size of the department was the question. So the size of the department was, some people thought it was a good idea to try and bring everything together. Others argued that actually it gets too big and a bit unwieldy. And how do you really get one Secretary of State that can cover that enormous great remit? And even if you put business and energy and industrial strategy together, then where does the skills agenda fit? How do you deal with that? So where you draw the boundaries around departments. So then we got into conversations about, well, how else do you get a sort of common purpose across government departments? And the missions theme came up there and saying, well, can we use those to drive or encourage a common view of what might be going on? Particularly if you link those to a citizen focus and you think in the public sector, one of the things that many people are motivated by is that desire to deliver a service to the citizen. If you put that at the centre, then can we get more alignment in that particular route? We talked a bit about COVID as an example, and a number of people said, you know, during COVID, one of the really interesting things there was the speed at which things happened, not just in government, but across all sorts of walks of life. And people who are involved in trying to respond to COVID will recall I was involved in helping set a testing centre up here, and it was a collaboration between the University, AstraZeneca and GSK. We were just focused on getting the testing centre up and running. Politics didn't matter between the organisations. Legal contracts were not that important. We were just moving as fast as we could to get something done to try and get testing capacity in the UK, because it was a point at which we were struggling with testing capacity. So that everyone had that common goal, if you like. And I think that's, you can't recreate, we don't want to recreate COVID every so often, but how do you build that sense of common purpose across departments? Was a theme that we talked about. We liked the Operation Warp Speed example, and particularly the portfolio option where you were de-risking alternative solutions. And you can imagine how that takes some of the conflicts out as well if people are backing particular types of solution. But it's proved difficult to do outside of the COVID experience. And so questions about, I mean, that's partly an issue of duplication of effort and resource and so on, and it's a more costly approach, but there's some things to be said for it. We talked a bit about the importance of having a written industrial strategy, because actually if you have a written industrial strategy, particularly one that is cross-government, it forces some of the tensions in the system to be surfaced and debated, and you've got then a formal position of where the government is, and so you can have some of the arguments that need to be had. And then several countries used examples of bringing together groups under the Prime Minister. So they said actually one of the ways locally that people have got good traction is to create effectively new organisational units directly under the Prime Minister's authority, often for a limited time period to deal with a particular mission, to bring people together, and then they could disband. And that was raised in 3 or 4 different countries. I think a key theme for me across all of our discussions was really all about trust and relationships and how you build those trust and relationships. And particularly then you get into questions of process and how do you design a process to develop an industrial strategy or an innovation policy that actually builds confidence and trust across diverse groups of people without building an enormous exercise that means that thousands and thousands of people have to be consulted to get in the tent. And so there are points at which we had some nice examples of where people had deliberately got lots of people involved early on, but then smaller groups writing more formal papers at a later stage, but thinking quite deliberately about the process they'd used to actually develop the strategy. We also talked about changing seats, and a comment was made that it was more common in Europe than the US, which I was slightly surprised about, because whenever the US party changes, a lot of the political appointments change, but there was a theme that came up that said actually in Europe there tended to be a bit more changing of who was responsible for developing policy, and it then becomes much more difficult to build a trusted relationship with those individuals. And we talked about the importance of history, country region capability, the path dependency thing that Tim raised, and thinking about strength. So Singapore with 2 sovereign wealth funds gives enormous capacity to do particular things that other places don't have. Challenges. So I think there was a really interesting conversation that sort of ran through the day, which was about the level at which we are trying to develop industrial policy or innovation policy and so on. And by that I mean, is it a national conversation? Is it a regional within-country conversation? So to what extent is it a place argument? Or to what extent is it an international conversation? And being a bit more explicit about which things we should be trying to deal with collaboratively at an international level, which things are really country specific and which things are much more local. And there may well be different topics for those different levels of analysis. Vince made the comment that in his experience, 2D was much easier than 3D. So 2D was thinking about the sectors, so the vertical, and supply chains, horizontal. But as soon as you add the place dimension in, whether that's within country or across regions, it becomes a much, much more complex set of issues. And we talked, as many people would have done, about the geopolitical overlay and the fact that actually that just makes the whole set of conversations more complicated at the moment. And I think there's a question about whether actually we need to almost view industrial strategy through the lens of scenarios, and you're thinking about how geopolitics might play out in different scenarios and what consequences that might have for slightly different forms of industrial strategy, so you've got flexibility in whatever strategy you come up with. So they were the sort of general themes. There were then some specific examples that came up from particular countries that we thought were really interesting. So in Singapore, Arno mentioned that senior ministers, once retired, if you've been Prime Minister, you don't then just step off the stage, but you end up as a senior minister to bring that experience back into government in the future. And so you retain some knowledge and history. Talked about frequent job rotations in the senior civil service in Singapore to build the network. You've got to balance that with the comment I made earlier about changing seats all the time. The second one we talked about, the industry transformation maps were an interesting theme. Tim raised that earlier. But there were lots of people who contributed to creation and consultation of those maps, but then the output actually managed by government. In EU, we talked a bit about the importance of Horizon Europe missions and how you could use those to create some sense of urgency and a sense of purpose. And that links back to the COVID example of, how that did create a sense of urgency for people. Brazil, we talked about the AI plan and how initially it was a bottom-up process, lots and lots of people involved, lots of ideas. Then an inter-ministry working group as a second phase, and then actually a third phase with a much smaller working group writing the final version of the plan. And although it says attempts, I would really think of those as phases in the sense that you needed to do the early ones to get a decent plan that people had bought into at the end. Talked about the 2D, 3D piece. Japan was PM initiatives, talked about that, and Italy PM initiatives as well, so we talked about those. And then the US, we talked a bit about the tech hubs that have been created, the 31 tech hubs around the US, the way that they were created in terms of very much a bottom-up process of people suggesting tech hubs that would work locally, and then a mechanism for signalling which technologies mattered. We talked about convergence, and here we had an interesting conversation about the institutional nature of some of these things. The challenge is that when you set organizations up, over time they become more and more institutionalized and more worried about their survival. And yet actually sometimes you want these things to be created and then you want them to morph and be flexible. So how do you build that flexibility in? In the case, in the US case, there was an example where things were set up and told that they have funding for 5 years. The danger then is that by year 2, the people in those organizations with 5-year life are just worrying about where the future funding is coming from. If it's not coming from government, it's going to come from industry. If it's coming from industry, it's coming from large companies. Therefore, you suddenly find that those institutions become just obsessed by what large companies might want, and that's not necessarily the right thing for the country as a whole. And so thinking carefully about how you build both limited life, but also reinventing institution structures was important there. And then we talked a bit about the industrial strategy, the last industrial strategy the UK went round. And one of the comments I'd make about that was I thought one of the things that the government did really well was have quite an open conversation with business at various points about the industrial strategy. So by the time it was launched, there was already quite a sense of momentum and excitement about it and a level of acceptance. And I think that's quite a powerful thing to think about. Anything else, Martin? Anything else that people think came up in group 3 that we haven't mentioned? No? Okay, thank you.